college football playoff round one in the books. Everybody's got thoughts. Everybody seemed to be up in arms about something this weekend. You were either mad about the playoff or you were mad about somebody being mad about the playoff. So a lot of people are upset. So I want to do a couple of things with you. Number one, I want to tell you where I'm coming from on this, and then I want to ask you where you're coming from. That is the key on the whole playoff topic, whether you're talking about which teams should be in versus which ones should have been left out, whether you're talking about how big the field should be, whether you're talking about which kinds of teams should get home field and or a bye in the first round. All of these things are being debated. Here's what I need to know. Where are you coming from? It is impossible to have a debate on this stuff or either a logic-based conversation on this stuff until I know the answer to that question. You got to tell me, just like I've got to tell you, where are you coming from? And what I mean by that is when I ask you, where are you coming from, I want to know the answer to one question. I wrote it down right here. What is the purpose of a playoff? I'm pausing. I'm letting you think about it. What is the purpose of a playoff? With that in mind, Colin, can you show me the tweet I put out yesterday? So as the SMU Penn State game is going the way it's going, I put out this tweet. And it says, anyone who believed a Cinderella could ever exist in college football was ignoring reality. A lot of people had a lot of different reactions to this. I was replying to some statements that were being made towards me. And the statements were, you seem to have a big problem with SMU getting a shot. You seem to have a problem with Boise State getting a shot. And I replied, they don't have a shot. And then I got shot back at me. Well, what do you mean they don't have a shot? They're in the playoff. And at that point I realized, oh, we're coming from different places. So pause again and ask the question, what is the purpose of a playoff? Because if you look at Boise being in and you look at SMU being in and saying, good for them, they got a shot. I look at them and I say they have no shot. I'm going to answer my question for you. I ask the question, where are you coming from on the playoff? I ask, what is the purpose of a playoff? To me, the purpose of a playoff is to crown a national champion. Everything about the playoff or a tournament or whatever you want to call it is about crowning a national champion. And it's not about inclusion. And it's not about just whether you make it. And it's not about the journey mattering more than the destination. Screw all that. I don't believe in all that. I think it's a waste of time to talk like that. I'm just giving you my perspective. Some of you are going to disagree with this. That's why we need to know where each other is coming from before we can have the debate. So to be very clear, when I look at a Boise State in a tournament like this, it makes no sense because Boise has no shot of winning this. Nor do a lot of teams that are going to be in it any given year, the bigger the field gets. See, my perspective was always, we don't even have 4 teams most years capable of winning a championship. And since a playoff is solely about crowning a champion to people like me, I don't need it to be any bigger a field than it already had been. Well, the first round happened yesterday, and we had a bunch of blowouts. And so everyone gets up in arms. Oh, I wasn't entertained, some people said. Or that proves that these teams shouldn't have been in. Well, it didn't prove they shouldn't have been in at all. The right teams were in. You may not expect to hear that from me, but the right teams were in. If I was on the committee and I was tasked with doing what they're supposed to do, I would have had Indiana in. I would have had SMU in. I would not have had Alabama in. I would not have had South Carolina in. I would not have had Miami in. I would not have had Ole Miss in. The right 12 teams were in the field, in my opinion. But the blowouts are inevitable, guys. Just like they were inevitable in the 4-team field. They are super inevitable, maybe in multiple rounds now in the 12-team field. So yesterday, I'm pointing this out. I'm saying a lot of your college football's utopian worldviews are getting shattered right now, and you're really having trouble coping with it. Because there are many, many people out there who truly believed if we expand this and we let a Boise get a shot, they could win a national championship. It's garbage. No, they can't. 10 times out of 10. This is not basketball. This is not Disney. This is football. People get to put their hands on you and physically impose their will on you. And there are too many teams that are deeper, bigger, faster, and stronger, and you don't have to play one of them. You got to play 3 or 4 of them. You will never string together a run that ends in a Cinderella moment. And to be clear, when I say Cinderella moment, I don't mean pulling an upset. Like if Boise beats Penn State in the Fiesta Bowl, that's not what I'm talking about. I'm talking about Boise beating Penn State and then beating Georgia and then beating Texas or Oregon or Ohio State. That's a Cinderella moment. It will never happen in college football. Never. Actually, the closest we'll come to a Cinderella moment is that team right there. That team right there, Ohio State, that's who this format leaves the back door open for. In the previous version of the format, Ohio State's out. One of the best teams in the country, but because they lost to Oregon and then they lost to Michigan, they're out. But now they're not. They're in. And they were an 8 seed, but they're in the playoff. That's your Cinderella. It was always going to be that way. You leave the back door open for more flawed Big Ten teams or flawed SEC teams, and they're going to make a run. Now, I didn't want that format. To be very clear, I thought 4 was enough. I would have been happy sitting with the BCS model back in the day because I don't care about the postseason as much as I care about the regular season. But the blowouts are happening yesterday, and I point out that, guys, this is what you asked for. A lot of you wanted the expansion, and that's what you signed up for, and that's okay. I'm going along with it, but you shouldn't be shocked by this. And it doesn't mean the wrong teams were in. It just means we will never have a year where 12 teams are capable of legitimately competing for a national championship, so it's all a mirage. You have to suspend disbelief. It's like watching a pro wrestling match. You have to willingly put aside the idea that you know it's scripted. In this playoff, for it to work, you have to put aside the idea that there is a truth deep down inside of most of you who have watched this sport for a while who understand an SMU is not winning the national title. Boise's not winning the national title. Indiana's not winning the national title. Now, that's where we separate into 2 camps. One camp just says that, and that's their argument. That's me. I'm in that camp. There's another camp that says, well, that's okay, though, because at least they had a shot, which they don't, if we define shot as having a chance to win a title, because they don't have that. But also, there is like a subset of that camp that truly believes just making the playoff is cause for celebration. Just making the playoff and the journey and the meaning, quote unquote, that it puts on more games, as if college football games didn't mean anything before the playoff was created, that justifies the expanded playoff. I simply disagree. I think that's a garbage mentality. So that's where we differ there. So I had people yelling at me yesterday, well, Josh, we had blowouts in the 4-team playoff, so there's nothing different. You're making my point, and you don't realize it. My point was, why would we expand a tournament that was already too big? 4 spots were too many, routinely. Routinely, the first round showed us that we had blowouts even when we just put 4 teams in there. That was the entire point that someone like me made when I said, why are we expanding this? But I got shouted down, and that's okay. So that's one part, okay? Then the next part, and by the way, if you're watching, even if I've said something you disagree with, that's okay. I'm happy to hear your point of view. Make sure you're subscribed to the channel. We do college football. That's all we do. I never copy and paste this over to the NBA or Major League Baseball. It's just college football here year-round. And if you subscribe, it helps us. It doesn't do anything for you. It doesn't sign you up for anything, but it helps us. So I appreciate it if you would do that. Colin, do we have the Feinbaum tweet? Okay. So yesterday, I get to Ohio Stadium, and Paul Feinbaum has fired this tweet off earlier in the morning. And boy, there was a lot being said about this. So I'm going to read it for you if you haven't seen it. I want to get your feel on it. Paul Feinbaum, friend of the show, by the way, Paul Feinbaum tweets out, so far, the College Football Playoff Selection Committee has given us some blockbusters. Notre Dame led late over Indiana 27-3, and Penn State just went up on the committee's final team 28-0 at the half. Take a bow. Dripping with sarcasm, mind you. And what he's saying there is basically because these games are blowouts, I guess the insinuation is the committee didn't do a good job. How do you feel about that? Before I tell you how I feel, I want to know how you feel about that. Did you feel when you were watching the first round that because there were a bunch of blowouts, the committee did a bad job? I didn't. So I want to know if you feel that way. Now, this may surprise you, because I was against expansion to begin with, and I put out power ratings every week, and teams like SMU, Brigham Young early in the season, Boise, they were never really in my top 12. So you may think I'd agree with that. I don't agree with that because how I power rate teams should never coincide with how a playoff is seeded. I've always told you that. Power ratings and rankings are totally different things. I thought the right teams were in the tournament. I said that the day of the selection. I said SMU got in over Alabama. They should have, in my opinion. It was close, but they should have gotten in. Got no problem with it. Indiana still in. Weak strength of schedule, flawed team, but you know what? It's a flawed year. And so I thought there was an excuse to put them in. Had no problem with it. I had no gripes with any of the teams in there. So I'm on record as saying that. Then the first round happens, and teams get blown out. I expected that. So that wasn't a big surprise to me, but apparently it was a surprise to a lot of people. And many of you echoed the sentiment of Paul, and you said, see, this right here is evidence that so-and-so should have been in. No, it's not. And I am a believer that Alabama would have performed much better than a couple of those teams would have. I'm a believer Ole Miss flat out would have gone into South Bend and won. I think that. I'll never be able to prove it, so who cares, right? But I think that it's irrelevant because they didn't belong in to begin with, because they didn't earn their way in based on the criteria that the committee is supposed to select off of. Now, if you think the criteria should change, okay, hey, I may agree with you. But the criteria is the criteria, and it doesn't exist in a vacuum. Everyone played by those rules this year, and the teams that, in my opinion, should have been in the tournament are in the tournament. But here's the thing. There's a big difference in, when you complain, like if you're of the opinion that the first round being blowouts was indicative of, or it was an indication, the first round's full of a bunch of blowouts, so it's an indication that the committee did a bad job. That's the difference in a selection committee and a production company. And I had to say this to a couple of my buddies yesterday because I really don't think that they distinguish between the two. If I'm watching a Netflix special and I don't like that there are so many plot holes in this series, well, I'm going to criticize because that is a production. It is made for entertainment purposes. And that production company, that writing team, they screwed up. That's a very, very valid take to have. This is competitive sports. A selection committee is not writing the script for the playoff for you. The selection committee is given a list of criteria, and based off that, they put the teams in that they feel are most deserving, and then they go play. And in a game where we have vast disparity in styles of teams, in quality of roster, we score in 3s and 7s, the ball's shaped very funny, and these venues house 100,000+ people, and when it's 25 degrees and they're screaming, it's tough to play, you're going to have some blowouts. You absolutely are. That doesn't mean they got it wrong. It doesn't mean anything's wrong, per se. It's just kind of like this on-demand mentality, which I can slip into as well, so I've been guilty of this, but there's this on-demand mentality of, in the modern age, if everything I'm ingesting is not perfectly in alignment with what I want, something's wrong. It's not always the case, guys, especially in sports, which brings me to my next point. The spirit of competition, what does it mean to you? I am asking a bunch of questions here intentionally because it's my understanding at this point, we don't agree on all this. We got many, many different schools of thought. I'm not even saying any of them are wrong. They're just different. But it is important for me to know where you're coming from, and I tell you where I'm coming from because it does nothing to shout at each other on Twitter. You don't get anywhere. You don't get any substantive change. You don't even understand where the other person's coming from. So I didn't have Colin or Jesse clip the thing last night, but I saw a clip from Kirk Herbstreit. They had him do a SportsCenter hit after the game last night, and he went off about the difference between best and most deserving. And he talked about how the future of the playoff conversation may sound different. And Indiana, you watch them on the field with Notre Dame, and they don't even look like they belong there. And just because they had a really good record, it doesn't mean that they should be in the playoff. Hey, I'm the one who constantly beats the drum that you are not always what your record says you are. I'm the first one to say that. So you get no disagreement with me that there are far more important metrics than just win and loss record in college football. Absolutely, 7 days out of the week, twice on Sunday. I agree with that. I also agree that you have to honor the spirit of competition first and foremost, or else you lose the spirit of competition. So best versus most deserving is really interesting. It's a really interesting and slippery slope to take yourself down. Because when you start talking about that, Really what you're saying is, I want the playoff that I want instead of the one that the spirit of competition dictates. So the spirit of competition includes results on the field, it includes all the criteria, and it's all baked in, it's all put into a blender and poured out, and like that's how you field a playoff. That's how you select teams and seed the teams. And we can argue on the semantics. We can argue on the criteria. I've got no problem with doing that. I've got input. I've got things that I wish would change. But I'll tell you what I hope never changes. What I hope never changes is there are outcomes happening on the field, but because it's in direct contrast with my college football worldview, if this team is ranked higher, but I think this lower ranked team is better, therefore they should be in the playoff, that violates spirit of competition. It's why when I put out my own power ratings every week, I had Ole Miss in the top 6 at the end of the season. And yet I looked you in the eye and said, now please understand, I got Ole Miss number 6 because I think they're the 6th best team in the country. But that's not what their resume says. What their resume says is they belong on the outside looking in when it comes to the playoff. I had Alabama in the top 10. But I told you, just because I think Alabama would do something doesn't mean anything. Just because I think they'd be favored on a neutral field doesn't mean anything. Because if that's how we seeded the playoff, we would cease being a selection committee. We would just be a production company. We would cease being a sport. We would just kind of be a movie. Oh, it would be very entertaining. The product would be very entertaining. But at what cost? Because if you really want to know, I was talking to Ari Wasserman about this in the press box last night. Our boy was heated. Oh, man, I had to... Here's the scene, okay? You got Ari Wasserman over here just yelling, and I'm fanning. Calm down, buddy. People are looking at us. It's okay. He's fine. He's okay. Calm down. Shh. Shh. Couple of strokes of the cheek. Tell me what's wrong. He was worked up on this. I am too. I do not like the insinuation. Now, this surprises a lot of people because they actually think I fall into the camp of putting best teams in. Well, I need to ask you how you define best before I agree with you that we should just put the best teams in. Because I think most deserving is always the route we should go as long as we properly define what deserving means. At that point, we can get in the weeds of the selection committee criteria. We can redefine strength of schedule. We can do away with this foolishness of metrics like ranked wins. Because if you beat the number 25 team and nobody else in the top 100, and I beat number 27, 28, 29, 30, and 31, you do not have a better resume than me. Even though in the ranked wins category, it's 1-0 you. So we could argue about all that. But we got to arrive at a place where we have a defined set of criteria. Everybody knows what the situation is going in. We are not blindly adhering to win and loss record because it's stupid. But we're going to honor the spirit of competition because this is sports. So you always have to do that, or you are not playing a sport. You're just kind of acting. You're kind of participating in something that is competitive because you're still playing. There's an authentic outcome on the game. But at the end, if the result is not what you wanted, you just reverse engineer it to get your result anyway. That's not sports. You cannot have college football be that way. So, look, here's the reality of it. People will call me an SEC homer for this. I don't care. There is a suspension of disbelief that is required to fully buy into the national concept of college football. And here it is. It's no different than watching pro wrestling. It's no different than watching David Copperfield work on stage as an illusionist. It's no different than watching a movie, Friday the 13th. You understand, this is a work. This is fake. This is choreographed. But I'm going to suspend the part of me that understands that because it's no fun to watch a movie or watch a pro wrestling match with that mentality, and I'm going to buy into it because that entertains me. So I will suspend my disbelief. Look, college football is different because it's a sport, and the outcome, contrary to some message board belief, is not predetermined. But there is a suspension of disbelief that is required to fully buy into this being a national sport. Because here's the reality. Conferences like the SEC are deeper than everyone else. Most years. The best coaching staffs and the deepest coaching staffs, in large part, are in the SEC most years. And then you've got the Big Ten as well. More and more so as the years have gone by. The best players disproportionately. The best rosters disproportionately. The best quarterbacks disproportionately are going to be in those two conferences. The best facilities, disproportionately, are going to be in those two conferences. The biggest recruiting budgets, the biggest NIL budgets, disproportionately, are going to be in those two conferences. And even within those two conferences, it's a concentration of a few teams. And then you throw in some teams from the ACC at the very top, and you throw in Notre Dame. And most people understand, look, if Notre Dame's 10-2 and UL Monroe is 10-2, Notre Dame's better than UL Monroe. In fact, if Notre Dame's 10-2 and UL Monroe's undefeated, Notre Dame's probably still better than UL Monroe. But you have to suspend the disbelief a little bit in order to buy college football as a true national comparable entity to other national sports. And you have to sometimes just keep your mouth shut. And you have to understand, like I did this year with SMU or Indiana, I don't think on a neutral field with everything on the line, either one of those teams would be able to tote SM or Alabama's job or Ole Miss's job. I think South Carolina would beat them both. But I wouldn't put them in, and I'm going to tell you why. Because it's not an SEC invitational tournament. It's the college football playoff. It may be more entertaining with those teams in. I think the rights holders would have enjoyed it more if those teams were in. It's not a production company, guys. You cannot run a sport that way. You cannot run a sport that way because at that point, the message you have sent is the spirit of competition is not what's most important. And I'm a believer for the long-term sustainability of college football. If I have to watch an SEC team every once in a while that I think is better get left out over a team that is more deserving as defined by the listed criteria, then so be it. Because for the long-term health of the sport always being based on spirit of competition, mattering first and foremost, that to me is what outweighs everything else. I know many of you disagree with me on that. I'm not going to change your mind, I don't think. But at least you know where I'm coming from on it. You know, so when I say I think SMU should have been in over Alabama, it's not because I think they were better than Alabama. Quite the opposite. I think Alabama would have handled them pretty thoroughly. But I think there's more to it than that. But it's not record. Trust me, it's not record.